Anzio Beachhead, Italy, late February 1944. In a forward outpost dug into wet Italian clay, a German officer of the 4th Parachute Division sits down with a private diary he is not supposed to keep and writes about the men across the wire from him. He does not know their unit designation. He does not know their names. He only knows that for 3 weeks they have not let him sleep. American parachutists, he writes, devils in baggy pants, are less than 100 meters from my outpost line. I can't sleep at night. They pop up from nowhere and we never know when or how they will strike next. Seems like the black-hearted devils are everywhere. He would be killed within days. American soldiers found the diary on his body, and when they read his words back to each other in the cold, something in them recognized itself. They took the name he had given them, devils in baggy pants, and they kept it, the way a man keeps a wound that turned out to be worth having. This is not the poster version of that story, not the recruiting office version, the one with the eagle patch gleaming and the trumpet swelling underneath. This is the version written by the men who were sent to kill them and failed, the German officers who watched the 82nd Airborne Division come apart armies twice its size, and who tried in reports and diaries and after-action assessments to explain what they were looking at. 7 months after that diary entry, at a Dutch city called Nijmegen, those same paratroopers would do something so far outside the German officer corps' understanding of infantry warfare that men who had fought in Russia, men who had seen the worst that industrialized killing had to offer, would write about it as though they had witnessed a kind of madness they had no vocabulary for. We are going to tell you what they wrote. The paratrooper's diary entry survives because it was extraordinary, but it was not written by an inexperienced man. The German parachute divisions fighting at Anzio in the winter of 1944 were not conscripts. The Fallschirmjäger were an elite arm of the Luftwaffe, hardened in Crete in 1941 in North Africa, in the brutal defensive fighting of Sicily and the Italian mainland in 1943. By the time this unnamed officer sat in his outpost above the Anzio marshes, he had already survived nearly 3 years of the war's worst fighting. He was not a man given to exaggeration, and he was certainly not a man inclined to praise the enemy. German field reports from this period are clinical almost to the point of coldness, casualty figures, map coordinates, unit designations. That this officer broke from that convention, that he reached for a phrase as vivid and half-superstitious as black-hearted devils, tells you something about what 3 weeks of contact with the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment had done to him. He was describing men who, that winter, were only beginning to build the record that would define them. The 82nd Airborne Division traced its lineage back to the trench fighting of the First World War, but the division that would terrify the German officer corps in 1944 was something new. America's first attempt to build an entire division around the untested idea that soldiers could be delivered to a battlefield by parachute and glider, and fight as a cohesive force the moment their boots hit the ground. It was redesignated an Airborne Division in August 1942 under Major General William Ley, and within it, the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment was activated on May 1, 1942, at Fort Benning, Georgia. The training was, by design, close to unbearable. Volunteers only, the Army would not conscript men into a role that demanded jumping out of an airplane into contact with the enemy. Washout rates in the early jump schools ran near 50%. The men who survived it absorbed a doctrine that would have sounded reckless to a conventional infantry commander. Land scattered alone, often behind enemy lines with no secure flank and no easy line of retreat, and fight anyway immediately, with whatever men and weapons happened to be nearby. Colonel Reuben Tucker, who would lead the 504th through Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and eventually Nijmegen, built his regiment around a simple, brutal expectation that a paratrooper who found himself isolated and outnumbered was not a paratrooper in trouble. He was a paratrooper doing his job. By September 1944, the division, now under Brigadier General James Gavin, at 37 the youngest general officer to command an American division in that war, had already fought in Sicily at Salerno and through the meat grinder of Anzio, where the 504th earned the name the dead German officer had given them and wore it from then on without irony. The training that produced this regiment was designed quite deliberately to break men who weren't suited to it, and to leave behind something that functioned less like a conventional infantry company and more like a collection of small, self-sufficient fighting units that happened to share a chain of command. A conventional infantry doctrine assumes an unbroken line mutual support, a rear area to fall back into. Airborne doctrine assumed the opposite from the first day of training, that a man might land alone in a field a mile from his objective, with none of his officers in sight and half his equipment lost in the drop, and that his job was to find the nearest American uniform, however few, and start fighting anyway. It is difficult to overstate how strange this looked to a German army built on centralized command and carefully rehearsed maneuver. German assessments of Allied airborne troops drafted after Sicily, and again after Salerno, kept circling the same uneasy observation, that these units seemed to function better, not worse, once scattered and cut off from their commanders, which ran against everything the German officer corps had been taught about the fragility of dispersed infantry. Nijmegen would be different from anything that came before it. Nijmegen would be the operation German intelligence officers spent the rest of the war trying to explain to each other. On September 17, 1944, the 82nd Airborne Division dropped from the sky near the Dutch city of Nijmegen as part of Operation Market Garden, Field Marshal Montgomery's audacious plan to seize a chain of bridges running deep into occupied Holland and pour an entire armored corps across the Rhine before winter. The 82nd's assignment sounds almost administrative when you say it plainly. Secure the bridges at Grave, the crossings of the Maasval Canal, and most critically the great highway and railway bridges spanning the Vaal River at Nijmegen itself. 11 bridges in all. Miss any one of them, and the corridor northward to the British paratroopers fighting for their lives at Arnhem would collapse. The early objectives fell with the kind of speed that made the plan look inspired. Companies of the 504th seized the Grave Bridge, nearly half a mile long, the longest in the operation, within hours of landing after a firefight lasting barely 3, but Nijmegen itself refused to cooperate. The Germans, reacting far faster than Allied intelligence had predicted, rushed elements of the 10th SS Panzer Division into the city, and by September 19, 2 separate American and British attempts to storm the highway bridge head-on had been thrown back with heavy losses. The Germans held the northern approach to both bridges with the kind of dug-in, disciplined firepower that made a frontal assault look like suicide. General Gavin reached a hard conclusion. The bridge could not be taken from one side. It would have to be attacked from both banks of the Vaal at once, which meant someone would have to cross nearly 400 yards of open river in broad daylight directly into the guns of an SS Panzer Division to attack the far bank from behind. That mission went to Major Julian Cook's 3rd Battalion, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Julian Cook was 27 years old, a native of Vermont, and a 1940 graduate of West Point, the kind of officer the Army had spent years grooming for exactly this sort of moment, though nothing in his training had prepared him for what he was being asked to do now. Standing on the 9th floor of a power plant on the south bank of the Vaal, staring across 400 yards of fast, cold current at a fortified Dutch stronghold called Fort Hof van Holland, bristling with German machine guns and 20mm cannon, Cook had one thought, later recorded in the regimental history almost exactly as he said it. Somebody has come up with a real nightmare. There were not enough boats. What arrived hours late, delayed by German shelling of the single road the British called Hell's Highway, were 26 flimsy canvas assault craft, each meant to carry perhaps a dozen men and 3 collapsible paddles, into a current that would fight every stroke. When General Gavin briefed Cook on the plan, Cook's response was blunt to the point of insubordination. If you wanted men on the north bank of the river, General, it would have been very simple to have dropped them there in the beginning. Gavin had considered it and rejected it for fear of losing an entire battalion to a scattered drop with no way to reinforce it. Now there was no better option left. At 3:15 in the afternoon on September 20th, under a smoke screen that was already thinning faster than anyone wanted, Cook climbed into the first boat. Accounts differ slightly on what was said in that boat as it pushed off. Some who were there remember silence. Others remember officers reciting the rosary under their breath, Hail Mary, full of grace, timed almost like a rowing cadence. What no one disputes is what came next. The Germans opened fire almost immediately from 3 directions at once, from the fort ahead, from the railway bridge to the east, from positions on the south bank that had not yet been cleared. Of 26 boats, 6 had already been lost to shelling before the crossing even began. The smoke meant to hide the attack for the full 400 yards, thin within the first 100 as smoke shells ran short and machine gun barrels overheated on the covering tanks of the Irish Guards. Men who had only 3 paddles to a boat capsizing with the weight of a dozen soldiers switched, without being told to paddling with the flat wooden stocks of their rifles, a detail so small and so desperate that it says more about the crossing than any casualty figure could. Captain Henry Keep, a Princeton-trained oarsman who understood exactly how badly these boats were built for what they were being asked to do, wrote afterward of boats all crammed with frantically paddling men. Of a scene, in his words, of defenseless, frail canvas boats, all jammed to overflowing with humanity. All striving desperately to cross the Vaal as quickly as possible and get to a place where at least they could fight. Because, as Keep understood better than most, dying helpless in an open boat was a soldier's worst fear, and dying while fighting back was, perversely, almost a relief by comparison. Of the 26 boats that started, 11 reached the far shore in the first wave. 48 men of the 504th were killed in the crossing alone, with dozens more wounded before a single paratrooper had fired a shot from solid ground. And then the survivors did the thing that would end up in a German staff officer's after-action file with a question mark next to it, because there was no standard tactical vocabulary to describe it. They got out of the boats and they charged. Waverly Ray had led from the front since the Normandy jump in June, and at Nijmegen he did it again for the last time. As the survivors of the first wave crossed the open, ditch-lined polder beyond the riverbank, flat ground with almost no cover, cut by drainage ditches running in straight, exposed lines toward the German positions, German tanks began working the flank of the advance. Ray took a bazooka team, 3 officers among them, out around that flank and through a rail yard to get at the armor from an angle the Germans hadn't covered. He was killed in the fighting that followed. But the flank held, and D Company, bleeding heavily, pushed on through the rail yard and into the German positions beyond it, because the ground Ray's team had cleared was the only ground that let them move. John R. Toll was 19 years old, from Cleveland, Ohio, and had enlisted in 1943, a boy by any honest measure who had already fought in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy by the time his unit, C Company of the 504th, reached Holland. In the fighting around Oosterhout, days after the Waal crossing, Toll manned a rocket launcher against a German counterattack that included tanks and a half-track. He hit 2 tanks and forced the half-track out of the fight. When he saw 9 German soldiers take cover inside a nearby house, he reloaded and fired directly into it. Seconds after firing on a third vehicle, a mortar round killed him. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for what the citation called conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. He had turned 19 that April. Frank Metcalf was among the men who went into the water on September 20th and never made it to the fighting on the North Bank in the way he'd intended. Wounded in the crossing or shortly after, accounts of the exact sequence vary slightly. As accounts of chaotic river assaults tend to, Metcalf was found by soldiers of the 10th SS Panzer Division, who, rather than finishing what the river had started, took him prisoner and marched him to Nijmegen's Belvedere Castle. He would spend the next 8 months moving between some of the worst prisoner-of-war camps in the German system, attempting escape more than once. Decades later, at a 75th anniversary ceremony in Nijmegen, a 97-year-old Metcalf joked that he had technically accomplished his mission of reaching the far side of the bridge. He'd simply had a Nazi escort to get there. He also said something less light, that he considered himself fortunate to have been taken by the 10th SS rather than the 9th, a division, he said, that had just arrived from Italy after annihilating an entire town. They killed everybody, women and children, everybody in that town. It is the kind of detail a documentary is tempted to leave out because it complicates the tone. We are leaving it in because Metcalf thought it mattered enough to say, and because it tells you what kind of mercy, arbitrary, thin, dependent entirely on which unit happened to reach you first, was actually available on that battlefield. What German commanders could not explain in any report that survives is why the assault worked at all. By every calculation available to a Wehrmacht staff officer trained in conventional infantry doctrine, an unsupported river crossing in daylight against prepared positions with no cover on the far bank should have been annihilated in the water. Kampfgruppe Uhling, the SS battle group holding the bridge approaches, roughly 500 men strong, had the terrain, the fortification, and the firepower to make that happen. Instead, in the space of a few hours, over 300 of Uhling's soldiers were killed, 60 were taken prisoner, and the rest broke and fled toward the bridge itself. Around dusk that same day, 200 to 300 German soldiers approached the exhausted survivors of the 504th not to counterattack, but to surrender. There is no single surviving German psychological assessment specifically written about the Waal crossing in the way the script structure would like there to be. Historians who have combed German unit records for Market Garden have not turned up an officer's memo coining a phrase for what he just watched. What we have instead is a British officer's judgment, offered by a man with no reason to inflate American accomplishments and every institutional reason to guard his own service's reputation. Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, commander of the British 1st Airborne Corps, a guards officer who had already seen the worst of the First World War, watched the crossing from the South Bank, and afterward told General Horrocks without qualification, "I have never seen a more gallant action." That is the German problem stated from the other side of the river. An officer corps that measured courage in disciplined formations and covered advances had just watched 2 companies cross open water in canvas boats, take 48% casualties before reaching solid ground and keep going. There was no doctrine for it. There was only 5 months earlier one dead officer's diary entry, reaching for the word devils because no ordinary word for soldier seemed to cover it. By late afternoon on September 20th, the survivors of the 3rd Battalion had fought their way off the polder, through the rail yard and to the northern end of the railway bridge, and within the same hours, another element of the 504th had seized the northern end of the highway bridge itself after brutal, close-range fighting in the streets and squares of Nijmegen. For the first time since the operation began 3 days earlier, both ends of both bridges were in Allied hands at once. British Sherman tanks of the Guards Armored Division, waiting on the southern approach, began rolling across the Nijmegen Highway Bridge that evening. The same bridge the Germans had wired with demolition charges and fully intended to destroy, until American and British engineers cut the wires in the final hours, in a race that has since become its own small legend of the operation. It should have been the hinge point of Market Garden the moment the corridor to Arnhem finally opened. It nearly was, but it had taken a full day longer than the plan allowed, and 11 miles to the north, John Frost's British paratroopers, who had held the Arnhem Bridge alone since the operation's first hours, could not hold it any longer. The Nijmegen bridges were secured on the evening of September 20th. Arnhem fell the next day. That is the bitter arithmetic at the center of this story, and any honest telling has to sit with it. The 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment performed what a British Corps commander called the most gallant action he had ever witnessed, executed a river assault that by every rule of infantry doctrine should not have succeeded, and it still was not fast enough to save the men 11 miles up the road. Market Garden, taken as a whole, is remembered as a failure. The Val crossing, taken on its own terms, is remembered as something closer to a legend the paratroopers themselves are almost embarrassed to be asked about, because the men who survived it tend to talk less about their own courage than about the friends who didn't make it out of the boats. We opened with a German officer's diary, written in a muddy outpost above the Anzio beachhead in February 1944. We have to be honest about how that story ends, because it does not end the way these stories are supposed to end. There is no scene of him decades later, gray-haired, reflecting on old enemies over a drink. He was killed within days of writing those words. He never knew the name he gave a regiment of American paratroopers would outlive him by 80 years and counting. He never knew that 7 months after his death, the same men he'd called black-hearted devils would cross a Dutch river in canvas boats and do something that would make a British general, no less, run out of adequate words of his own. There is something almost unbearably fitting in that. The man who named them didn't live long enough to see how right he'd been. The 504th carried his phrase forward not as a boast but almost as an inheritance. Devils in baggy pants, the name a dead enemy gave them, worn from Anzio to Nijmegen to the frozen counterattack against Kampfgruppe Paper's SS Panzers 3 months later in the Ardennes, were German prisoners. Interrogated by American intelligence officers, were already using the paratroopers' own reputation against them, describing the men in the strange, baggy jump trousers with a wariness that had nothing to do with unit designations and everything to do with what had already happened at Nijmegen and would keep happening until the war ended. They did not call themselves devils. An enemy did, in a diary he thought no one would ever read in the last days of his life. And the strange, terrible honesty of war is that sometimes the enemy sees you more clearly than your own side does, sees not the doctrine, not the training pamphlets, not the recruiting posters, but the plain fact of men who would not stop coming. Devils in baggy pants, he wrote, because he had no other word for it. Devils in baggy pants, the survivors of the Val repeated, because by September 20th, 1944, the name had stopped being an insult and become a simple description of what the job required. Devils in baggy pants, a phrase written by a man who never got to see what he'd predicted, carried by men who never asked to be called it, and left behind by both of them as the only accurate account anyone ever wrote of what happened on that river. The Germans had a word for what should have stopped them at the water's edge. They just never got the chance to use it.